Helen Keller, Chapter 21. Helen Keller, The Story of My Life, Chapter 21. I have thus far sketched the events of my life, but I have not shown how much I have depended on books, not only for pleasure and for wisdom that bring to all who read, but also for that knowledge which comes to others through their eyes and their ears. Indeed, books have meant so much more in my education than in that of others, that I shall go back in the time when I began to read. I read my first connected story in May 1887 when I was 7 years old, and from that day to this I have devoured everything in the shape of a printed page that has come within the reach of my hungry fingertips. As I have said, I did not study regularly during the early years of my education, nor did I read accordingly to rule. At first I had only a few books in raised print, Readers for Beginners, a collection of stories for children, and a book about the earth called Our World. I think that was all. But I read them over and over until the words were so worn and pressed I could scarcely make them out. Sometimes Miss Sullivan read to me, spelling into my hand little stories and poems that she knew I should understand. But I preferred reading myself to being read to, because I liked to read again and again the things that pleased me. It was during my first visit to Boston that I really began to read in good earnest. I was permitted to spend a part of each day in the institution library and to wander from bookcase to bookcase and take down whatever book my fingers lighted upon. And read I did. Whether I understood one word in 10 or 2 words on a page, the words themselves fascinated me, but I took no conscious account of what I read. My mind must, however, have been very impressionable at this period, for it retained many words and whole sentences to the meaning of which I had not the faintest clue, and afterwards, when I began to talk and write, these words and sentences would flash out quite naturally, so that my friends wondered at the richness of my vocabulary. I must have read parts of many books in those early days. I think I never read any one book through, and a great deal of poetry in that uncomprehending way, until I discovered Little Lord Fauntleroy, which was the first book of any consequence I read understandingly. One day my teacher found me in a corner of the library poring over the pages of the Scarlet Letter. I was then about 8 years old. I remember she asked me if I liked Little Pearl, and explained some of the words that had puzzled me. Then she told me that she had a beautiful story about a little boy which she was sure I would like better than the Scarlet Letter. The name of the story was Little Lord Fauntleroy, and she promised to read it to me the following summer. But we did not begin the story until August. The first few weeks of my stay at the seashore were so full of discoveries and excitement that I forgot the very existence of books. Then my teacher went to visit some friends in Boston, leaving me for a short time. When she returned, almost the first thing we did was to begin the story of Little Lord Fauntleroy. I recall distinctly the time and place when we read the first chapters of the fascinating child's story. It was on a warm afternoon in August. We were sitting together in a hammock which swung from 2 solemn pines at a short distance from the house. We had hurried through the dishwashing after luncheon in order that we might have as long as an afternoon as possible for the story. As we hastened through the long grass toward the hammock, the grasshoppers swarmed about us and fastened themselves on our clothes, and I remember that my teacher insisted upon picking them all off before we sat down, which seemed to me an unnecessary waste of time. The hammock was covered with pine needles, for it had not been used while my teacher was away. The warm sun shone on the pine trees and drew out all their fragrance. The air was balmy, with the tang of the sea in it. Before we began the story, Miss Sullivan explained to me the things that she knew I should not understand, and as we read on she explained the unfamiliar words. At first there were many words I did not know, and the reading was constantly interrupted, but as soon as I thoroughly comprehended the situation, I became too eagerly absorbed in the story to notice mere words, and I am afraid I listened impatiently to the explanation that Miss Sullivan felt to be necessary. When her fingers were too tired to spell another word, I had for the first time a keen sense of my deprivations. I took the book in my hands and tried to feel the letters with an intensity of longing that I could never forget. Afterwards, at my eager request, Mr. Aganas had this story embossed, and I read it again and again until I almost knew it by heart, and all through my childhood Little Lord Fauntleroy was my sweet and gentle companion. I have given these details at the risk of being tedious, because they are in such vivid contrast with my vague, mutable, and confused memories of earlier reading. From Little Lord Fauntleroy I date the beginning of my true interest in books. During the next 2 years I read many books at my house and on my visits to Boston. I cannot remember what they all were or in what order I read them, but I know that among them were Greek heroes, La Fontaine's Fables, Hawthorne's Wonder Book, Bible stories, Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, A Child's History of England by Dickens, The Arabian Nights, The Swift Family Robinson, The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Little Women, and Heidi, a beautiful little story which I read afterwards in German. I read them in intervals between study and play with an ever-deepening sense of pleasure. I did not study nor analyze them. I did not know whether they were well written or not. I never thought about style or authorship. They laid their treasures at my feet, and I accepted them as we accept the sunshine and the love of our friends. I loved Little Women because it gave me a sense of kinship with girls and boys who could see and hear. Circumscribed as my life was in so many ways, I had to look between the covers of books for news of the world that lay outside my own. I did not care especially for the Pilgrim's Progress, which I think I did not finish, or for the Fables. I read La Fontaine's Fables first in an English translation, and enjoyed them only after a half-hearted fashion. Later, I read the book again in French, and I found that, in spite of the vivid word pictures and the wonderful mastery of language, I liked it no better. I do not know why it is, but stories in which animals are made to talk and act like human beings have never appealed to me very strongly. The ludicrous characters of the animals occupy my mind in the exclusion of the morale. Then, again, La Fontaine seldom, if ever, appeals to our highest moral sense. The highest chords he strikes are those of reason and self-love, though all the fables run through thought that man's morality springs wholly from self-love, and that if that self-love is directed and restrained by reason, happiness must follow. Now, so far as I can judge, self-love is the root of all evil, but, of course, I may be wrong, for Montaigne had greater opportunities of preserving men than I likely ever to have. I do not object so much to the cynical and satirical fables as those in which momentous truths are taught by monkeys and foxes. But I love the Jungle Book and wild animals I have known. I feel a genuine interest in the animals themselves, because they are real animals, not characters of men. One sympathizes with the loves and hatreds, laughs over their comedies, and weeps over their tragedies, and if they point out a moral, it is subtle, and we are not conscious of it. My mind opened naturally and joyously to the conception of antiquity. Greece, ancient Greece, exercised a mysterious fascination over me, and my fancy the pagan gods and goddesses still walked on earth and talked face to face with men, and in my heart I secretly built shrines to those I loved best. I knew and loved the whole tribe of nymphs and heroes and demigods. No, not quite all, for the cruelty and greed of Medea and Jason were too monstrous to be forgiven, and I used to wonder why the gods permitted them to do wrong and then punished them for their wickedness, and the mystery is still unsolved. I often wonder how God can dumbness keep, while sin creeps grinning through his house of time. Reminds me of my father. It was the Iliad that made Greece my paradise. I was familiar with the story of Troy before I read it in the original, and consequently I had little difficulty in making the Greek words surrender their treasures after I passed the borderlines of grammar. Great poetry, whether written in Greek or in English, needs no other interpreter than a responsive heart. Would that the host of those who make the great works of the poets Odysseus, by their analysis, impositions, and laborious comments, might learn the simple truth? It is not necessary that one should be able to define every word and give its principal parts and its grammatical position in the sentence in order to understand and appreciate a fine poem. I know my learned professors have found greater riches in the Iliad than I shall ever find, but I am not avaricious. I am content that others should be wiser than I. But with all their wide and comprehensive knowledge, they cannot measure their enjoyment of that splendid epic, nor can I. When I read the finest passages of the Iliad, I am conscious of a soul sense that lifts me above the narrow, cramping circumstances of my life. My physical limitations are forgotten, my world lies upward, and the length and the breadth and the sweep of the heavens are mine. My admiration for the Iliad is not so great, but it is nonetheless real. I read as much as possible without the help of notes or a dictionary, and I always like to translate the episodes that please me especially. The word painting of Virgil is wonderful sometimes, but his gods and men move through the scenes of passion and strife and pity and love like the graceful figures in Elizabethtown Masque, whereas in the Iliad they give 3 leaps and go on singing. Virgil is serene and lovely like a marble Apollo in the moonlight. Homer is a beautiful animated youth in the full sunlight with the wind in his hair. How easy it is to fly on paper wings, from Greek heroes to the Iliad with no day's journeys, nor was it altogether pleasant. One could have traveled around the world many times while I trudged my weary way through the labyrinth mazes of grammars and dictionaries, or fell into those dreadful pitfalls called examinations, set by schools and colleges for the confusion of those who seek after knowledge. I suppose this sort of Pilgrim's Progress was justified by the end, but it seemed interminable to me in despite of the pleasant surprises that met me now and then in the turn of the road. Wow, that's beautiful. I began to read the Bible long before I could understand it. Now it seems strange to me that there should have been a time when my spirit was deaf to its wonderful harmonies. But I remember well a rainy Sunday morning when, having nothing else to do, I begged my cousin to read me a story out of the Bible. Although she did not think I should understand, she began to spell into my hand the story of Joseph and his brothers. Somehow it failed to interest me. The unusual language and repetition made the story seem unreal in faraway land of Canaan, and I fell asleep and wandered off into the land of Nod. Before the brothers came with a coat of many colors onto the tent of Jacob and told their wicked lie, I cannot understand why the stories of the Greeks should have been so full of charm for me and those of the Bible so devoid of interest, unless it was that I had made the acquaintance of several Greeks in Boston and had been inspired by their enthusiasm for the stories of their country, whereas I had not met a single Hebrew or Egyptian and therefore concluded that they were nothing more than barbarians and their stories about them were probably all made up, which hypothesis explained the repetitions and the queer names. Curious enough, it never occurred to me to call Greek patronymics queer, in quotation marks. She's so ahead of her time. But how shall I speak of these glories I have since discovered in the Bible? For years I have read it with an ever-broadening sense of joy and inspiration, and I love it as I love no other book. Still, there is much in the Bible against which every instinct of my being rebels, so much that I regret the necessity which has compelled me to read it through from beginning to end, and I do not think that the knowledge which I have gained of its history and sources compensates me for the unpleasant details it has forced upon my attention. For my part, I wish, Mr. Halls, that the literature of the past might be purged all that is ugly and barbarous in it, although I should object as much as one to having these great works weakened or falsified. There is something impressive, awful, in the simplicity and terrible directness of the book of Esther. Could there be anything more dramatic than the scene in which Esther stands before her wicked lord? She knows her life is in his hands. There is no one to protect her from his wrath, yet conquering her woman's fear, she approaches him, animated by the noblest patriotism, having but one thought: if I perish, I perish, but if I live, my people shall live. The story of Ruth, too, how oriental it is, yet how different it is from the life of the simple country folks from that of the Persian capital. Ruth is so loyal and gentle-hearted we cannot help loving her as she stands with the reapers amid the waving corn. Her beautiful, unselfish spirit shines out like a bright star in the night of a dark, cruel age. Love like Ruth's, loves which can rise above conflicting greeds and deep-seated racial prejudices, is hard to find in all the world. The Bible gives me a deep, confronting sense that things seen are temporal and things unseen are eternal. I do not remember a time since I have been capable of loving books that I have not loved Shakespeare. I cannot tell exactly when I began Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, but I knew that I read them all, at which a child's understanding and a child's wonder. Macbeth seemed to have impressed me most. One reading was sufficient to stamp every detail of the story upon my memory forever. For a long time ago, the ghosts and witches pursued me even into the dreamland. I could absolutely see the dagger in Lady Macbeth's little white hand. The dreadful stain was as real to me as the grief-stricken queen. I read King Lear soon after Macbeth, and I shall never forget the feeling of horror when I came to scene in which Gloucester's eyes are put out. Anger seized me, my fingers refused to move, I sat rigid for a long moment, the blood throbbing in my temples, and all the hatred that a child can feel concentrated in my heart. I must have made the acquaintance of Shylock and Satan about the same time, for the two characters were long associated in my mind. I remember that I was sorry for them. I felt vaguely that they could not be good even if they wished to, because no one seemed willing to help them or to give them a fair chance. Even now I cannot find in my heart to condemn them utterly. There are moments when I feel that the Shylocks, the Judases, and even the devil are broken spokes in the great wheel of good which shall in due time be made whole. Okay, that was Helen Keller, chapter 21, part 1. Okay, she's going over her different things that she's read in her life and how important books are to her. They're important to everybody, but it was her key, it was her Rosetta Stone to the world. Okay, that was Helen Keller, chapter 21 of The Story of My Life, part 1. Part 2 is coming up right next.